know our parashah this week is VaEtChanan, which I pleaded is what it means. And of course it's taken out of Deuteronomy 3:23. It goes into chapter 7, verse 11. And Haftarah this week is Isaiah 40, 1 through 26. The Chadasha is through the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 31 through 39. And this is also the Shabbat Nachamu. This is called the Shabbat of Comfort. And this week, as last week, we're continuing in the teaching of the generation who are beginning to enter the Promised Land. And they're also remembering the promise of God's comfort and what they have been brought through. And in regards to where last week we were remembering the destruction of the temple, we're also remembering God's comfort for the destruction of the temple. Well, because of the destruction of the temple, I might be better to say. But, as I stated last week, this idea that we should mourn for the loss of the temple, really for us as Messianics, is absurd. Yes, it is mournful that we no longer have a specific place that we can look towards that gives us a foundation in our faith. But the fact remains that because of this destruction, we have Messiah. We have the fullness of our faith. And therefore, if the temple is destroyed, then the Messianic age has begun, and the blessings of Messiah would befall on all that have taken him as their own. And that is the comfort that we can be relied upon and give strength and endurance to Adonai's people. This is Isaiah's cry to Israel, that promised restoration and reconciliation will, has, and is coming. Be sure. But our parashah opens up with Moses desiring to walk in the Promised Land. And Moses has forfeited his privilege of doing this because of his loss of control in the wilderness when at Kadesh Barnea he struck the rock to bring forth water instead of, as God had commanded him, speak to the rock. And secondly, they took the credit for it. They didn't give the credit to God. As Moses said to the children of Israel in his anger, would you have us to bring forth water from this rock for you? And therefore, stealing the glory that belongs to God, because God had already anointed the rock to bring forth water. And so we open up our portion in Deuteronomy 3, and we begin reading in verses 23 and 29. And I pleaded with Adonai that time, saying, O Lord, Adonai, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand, for what God is there in heaven or on earth, who can do the mighty deeds and mighty acts like yours. Please, let me cross over and see the good land across the Jordan, that good hill country in the Lebanon. But Adonai was angry with me because of you, so he would not listen to me. Enough, Adonai said to me. Do not speak to me any more about this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah. Look around the west and the north and the south and the east, and see with your own eyes, for you will not cross over this Jordan. But commission Joshua, and encourage and strengthen him, that he will cross over before this people, and he will enable them to inherit the land that you will see. So we stayed in the valley opposite Beth Peor. Moses had been judged for his actions by God. God's judgments cannot be taken back. They're not retroactive. And just as the scripture declares that you will reap the consequences of your actions, Moses has reaped the consequences of his. But God is still merciful in all of his judgment, and God has allowed Moses to at least be able to see that which he has struggled so hard to come to through the crossing in the wilderness. And he allows him to see the fulfillment of this journey from the top of Mount Pisgah. And Adonai has listened to Moses' plea. Knowing the character of Moses, we can understand that as Moses pleads before God, that these are all truly repentant pleas full of contrition. But Moses is not considering everything that God has had planned for the Israelites and for him. And in fact, it's for us the same. We all have things that we plead before the Lord that we would wish him allow us to do. There are things that we think that we ought to do because we feel like we should be able to do them in the Lord. But yet, God does not allow us to do them. Is that because God is hard-hearted? No. Is it because God does not desire us to be able to see the fulfillment of things that we have a heart for? Absolutely not. Moses had a heart for the land. Moses had a heart to take the people into the land. But Moses was not allowed to take the people into the land. And there's a twofold reason for it. The first part reason, as I stated earlier, it is the judgment of God. Moses had sinned before the Lord. Him, the leader of the Israelites, the example for them to be like, and he sinned so blatantly before them, he had to forfeit something that would have been of great value to him. And therefore God forfeited his ability to walk within the land of promise. Did that allow him not to still receive the salvation? No. Moses was still personally received by God. In fact, the Mishnah and the Talmud both speak of it was God who personally buried Moses' body. Therefore, his salvation is clearly still assured. And yet, he did not get to fulfill that what he thought he ought to be able to fulfill. But God had other reasons for this. One, Moses had been born and lived under Pharaoh's household. He had been directly taught in Pharaoh's courts. He understood the art of war. He understood strategy and battle tactics and all these things that would be necessary to lead an army against another nation. So the idea comes, if Moses was tempted and his extreme agitation to take credit for the miracle that God was going to perform for the people to bring forth water from a rock, would he not be tempted as well to take credit for the victory in defeating an enemy? Would not the people, knowing of Moses' knowledge and understanding and education, have more faith in Moses' ability to lead them in a battle than to have that trust and faith in the Lord their God? As we have seen throughout the entire Exodus process, that the Israelites have constantly questioned God and his motives, to his goodness and to his faithfulness, despite the fact that God had continually, throughout the entire journey, given them forgiveness and given them provision and everything that was necessary for their sustenance, and blessed them mightily. And therefore, this is why the leadership needs to change. Moses needs to go to God. Moses has finished that what God has called him to do. Moses has reached the age of righteousness, 120 years. And now it is time for him to be received back unto the Lord his God. Now, what is his comfort? His comfort is in knowing two things. One, his eyes has beheld the greatness of the promise that God has given his people. He has surveyed the entirety of the land, all of it, from the hills to the Lebanon. He could see from the vantage point in which God had called him to. Second, he could have hope and comfort in the knowledge that it is Joshua to whom God has turned over the leadership of the Israelites to. Joshua, a young man whom he personally mentored. Joshua, a man of a different spirit than all of the other Israelites, because out of all of the 10 spies, it was Joshua and Caleb who were given the right to enter the land, because they did not fear and they trusted in the Lord their God. Who better to lead the people than someone who had already invested and had declared their total allegiance and loyalty to the Lord their God? Who else, though, would the others follow except someone who could have given them that encouragement, that strength that comes from the boldness and courage in a relationship with God? And there's comfort in that. Moses does not have to leave this world wondering the outcome of the children of Israel. He has comfort and understanding that his own protege, a man he knows is worthy of the call, will surely do what God has done or said to do, and they will surely possess the land the Lord has given them. This is why God has refused Moses to lead the people in the land. He's prevented Moses from being further tempted and falling into the temptation of self-grandeur because of his exalted position as the leader of Israel. Remember, Moses was the one that told the people at Kadesh Barnea, "Would you have me strike this rock and bring forth water for you? Not would you have God to bring water forth from the rock, but would you have me?" Moses has forgotten that Adonai had already spoke to him concerning that, and that that rock would bring forth water, but not by striking it, but by speaking to it in the name of the Lord. And Moses erred, and Aaron along with him, and sinned by stealing this glory of the Lord. And this is why God denied Moses' plea. He's offering Moses comfort, his comfort, just like our Messiah taught the Talmudim to pray, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Teach us to be obedient to your leading and not our own, and we shall be delivered from ways that can lead us away from God." Adonai did not want Moses to again stray into rebellion because of the arduous task of leading the children of Israel. Moses doesn't need to learn any more of the greatness of Adonai. He has witnessed it all. He had seen it from the beginning of all the plagues in Egypt and to the finality where he was on the banks of the Jordan River. He has seen God's great and mighty hand. He has seen God's provision. And that's why only the sight of the promised land is necessary for Moses to finally find contentment over his service to the Lord, and to find contentment in the judgment of God because he has led him there. Moses is further comforted, of course, by Adonai's choice in Joshua to lead the children of Israel to the land. You know, in a way, God has been more graceful to Abraham here. Abraham, who's considered the father of all of the faithful, yet of the promise that God told him that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky or the sands on the seashore, the only one that Abraham ever saw was his son Isaac. The only comfort that he could take and the knowledge of that he would have many descendants was the fact that he was lived long enough to see his son Isaac marry Rebekah, knowing that eventually they would have children and he would become a grandfather and then a great-grandfather, and of course on and on and on. As well as Moses now. Moses not only gets to see the fulfillment of the land, but he also sees the fulfillment of the leadership of Israel. He's twice blessed. God is faithful and just in his promises. But these things are all brought about as God's judgments, which are perfect and complete, handed out of love and grace to those of his own. And those times when we think that we should be doing things that God that God does not think we should do? Do we not question God sometimes? How come we have to do this? How come we can't do these things? We pray to be able to do these things, and yet they're not allowed. It never comes to pass. It's not because God may not want you to do these per se. Maybe He wants you to go about it a different way. Maybe His plan for you is at a different time for this. God's promises are that He will use you in the way that best fits His plan, not yours. And it's not wrong to plead before the Lord, because He allowed Moses to plead with Him all the way up until he couldn't plead anymore. And God said, it's enough. And there will come the time when God would tell us when we plead before Him, it's enough. Accept what I have given unto you. Take comfort in the fact that I have chosen this for you. And out of it you have learnt the better things. Out of it you have brought more glory to me through this than the things that you think would bring glory out of it. Even personally, I've had to deal with this. What has happened to me with my leg. And it's not like I wouldn't plead with God to give me back whatever I had in ability before then. But I've come to a realization it's better to take comfort in the fact that He has given me still things to do for Him that will bring Him greater glory than to worry about the things I wished I could have done or would have liked to do. That's my will, not His. And therefore, I should take comfort in the knowledge that God didn't just abandon me because I wanted to do my will. He brought me closer to Him, and He gave me comfort in saying to me, you are still what I need to use as my servant, and used in a different way, a greater way. There's comfort in that. Abraham may have saw the land, but he never saw the multitude of children. Moses saw the multitude of children who could not enter the land. But like Isaiah the prophet, who was delivering the comfort of Adonai to his people during the time of testing and judgment for their rebellion to be fulfilled, Adonai would put an end to their suffering as well. Isaiah 40, verses 1 through 3. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to the heart of Jerusalem, and proclaim to her that her warfare is ended, and that her iniquity has been removed, for she has received from Adonai's hand double for all her sins. Israel has had to accept her punishment. Despite the fact that God declares the time of her redemption is set, that she should take comfort in the knowledge of God's future blessing as she endures the present judgment. This sentiment is what is restated by our Lord Yeshua in His discourse with the leadership in Jerusalem in Matthew 23, 37 through 39. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her, how often I long to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. Your judgment is here. For I tell you, you will never see me again until you say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. God is a God of judgment. That's one of His names. It's a Dayan Ha'emet, true judge. And therefore, when God judges, first He judges as His own. How do we project Him? What is the image the world has of Him because of His people? And if we fail to make the right image, He judges us. He casts us into the midst of chaos in order that way me and you may be drawn back to Him, and to the only real place of strength and comfort and protection there is. It's not that God desires our destruction. It's not that God desires to do us harm. It's that God desires to have us mature, to be made into that perfect image, that image of Him. And so therefore He allows His people to become judged and a righteous judgment. Even Israel, his own, are still under that judgment now, because they did refuse to receive the Messiah. But it's only for a temporary time, because as we know, as Messianics, the season has opened where the eyes are being opened of the people to the goodness of Messiah, that they are calling out in the name of the Messiah. So therefore, her time of her suffering is coming to an end. Because God desires for Israel to be, once again, his people. And the fullness of that means that they show the fullness of his image through Messiah Yeshua. And that day will come when all of us, all Messianics, will declare in one voice, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. And from that day will we hear Shofar Hagadol, the great shofar. The heavens will open up, the clouds will come aside, and our Mashiach will descend right unto the Mount of Olives from which he ascended. And the scriptures tell us that once he touches the Mount of Olives, it will divide in two and become a great valley for all of the world to come and worship the Lord our God. But that's when we, his people, have been brought back to that place where we realize the comfort of our God. What has he provided for us? Right now our brethren want a Messiah who will give them greatness and fame and fortune. But that's not the Messiah they need. They need the Mashiach ben Yosef, the suffering servant Messiah, first and foremost. They need for their hearts to become contrite before God. They need to realize that it is because of their unfaithfulness that God has sent the faithful one in order for them to be reconciled to him. It is the comfort of God to know, despite the iniquity of his own, that they have a way to become as white as snow. Though your sins be as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Why? Because the Lord himself, Adonai, has provided his own to give us comfort, to bring us back to him, to have a future, a new leadership. Not the leadership of the rabbinics, but the leadership of the Mashiach, who will bring back into perfect unity God and his people. And of course the world as well, because he came not just for his own, but for all who would call upon the name of Yeshua. They will all become children of God. And therefore God requires judgment. Like I said, of his own first. Who will we turn to when circumstances become difficult for us? Who can we turn to when circumstances become difficult to us? Will he not judge us as his own for our rebellion towards Yeshua, where we have failed to fulfill the Great Commission to take this good news to all of our brethren worldwide, to take it into the four corners of the earth, to proclaim to every Jew that has ever been in the diaspora that there is a Messiah. He has come, he has reconciled us back to God, and that the greater temple now exists, the temple not made with human hands, but the temple that was made out of the divineness of God himself, the Mishkan Hagadol. Yes, this is the answer to these questions. Just the same that we will experience judgment, we will also be given comfort through his word and his promise. It is these that we should offer as pleas before his throne, and not empty admonitions concerning our repentance. It is when we accept his will and his way that he intends for us to go, that he will give us the greatest comfort and blessing, because then we will be completely in his will, and therefore his plans can go forth exactingly as he desires, and then taking that spiritual promised land, which is the heart and the soul